Welcome to the BriteVibe podcast. At BriteVibe, we believe everyone deserves to be happy. But in today's world, everywhere you turn, there is division and negativity. At BriteVibe, we have created a global movement to bring 8 million people together who are inspired to live bright, live bold, and share bright vibes. Alone, it can be hard to change, but together we can change the world. Welcome to the BriteVibe podcast. William Kilmer, welcome to the BriteVibe podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I would love to have you on. In fact, I love the name of your book. We're going to get into that. But for our audience, for our viewers, tell us a little bit about William Kilmer. What's kind of your background?
Sure, absolutely. So I've been a tech entrepreneur and VC investor my entire career. So I've been really focused sort of on innovative technology, particularly around networking, cybersecurity, cloud. And I kind of have a unique position in that, I've grown up in the industry, have been in startups, been a founder previously, starting up a couple of cybersecurity companies and data analytics. And then I've also been a VC investor. And most recently, I've been working with a platform, an investment platform that we're focused on, particularly investing in and also starting new technology companies sort of from scratch. And so
wow.
my passion has always been in investing and really building great companies.
That's awesome. That's amazing. I'm an entrepreneur myself and love everything entrepreneurial. And it doesn't even really matter what the industry is. When I get around people that have started businesses or that are running businesses or wanting to start businesses, just like I love the stories, right? The stories are there's always an amazing story and continual story with anybody that's in business to any degree, especially when they're startups. Startups, there seems to be a magic to those, energy to them. There's just so many highs and lows all at once.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, to me, that's what's so addicting about it. No matter what side you're in, it's just that energy and enthusiasm for building something new and something that is going to be beneficial to others. It's just a drive that, is unlike any other.
Yeah, totally. You have a new book out called Transformative, right? That's the title of the book. And I know it it is about businesses, but I think, typically on the show, we talk about health, we talk about wellness, we talk about business, we talk about entrepreneurship, we talk about leadership, we talk about everything here. And so as we get into it, we can certainly talk organizationally, but then, if for listeners, obviously these same principles will apply to your personal life, your family life, other hobbies, whatever you have to do, right? So you basically have a premise that companies don't spend enough time in kind of the transformative space. I guess give us some color around that. Where do you think companies are failing or not doing as good as they should?
Right. So, I think there's a little backstory behind the book I'd love to share with you.
Yeah, please.
Again, I've got, a fair amount of experience in the industry. I've spent a lot of time with leaders, entrepreneurs in particular, which has been my passion. And, I've always been looking for what is sort of the right framework for thinking about, your business and how you're really going to accelerate it and grow and become something impactful. And that's the whole idea about transformative is like, what is the difference between a company that has had such impact on the market that they almost stand alone versus companies that, can grow, but they're sort of part of the market norm. And, so often we think about products and, they created a really interesting product. It's a new product. And we get this ideal that companies oftentimes are sort of the first to market. They're the ones who invented something that has become so big. And, I've spent a lot of time sitting in board meetings with working with CEOs and with others. And I really kind of went on this journey myself to say, how do I step back and really look at both what I've learned from working with so many great leaders, but also looking at some of the most transformative companies out there. And what can we distill away from that to really identify, how a company should look at their next great opportunity. And so transformative really is around essentially how companies are able to find, build, and then scale a market that they in particular can win. It's almost like they've tailor-fitted it to their capabilities and, have just done such an outstanding job at creating something new and that they basically win that market. And when you peel that back, there's very simple, very basic principles behind it. Number one is that, much to our surprise, most of these companies aren't out there inventing something that is just completely new. Oftentimes, they're taking a small seed of what's already in the market, something that's already in demand, and they're shifting that in a way that just creates such a profoundly different outcome for the customers that it ends up changing that market. And I think about one of my, favorite examples is a really simple one that, some people who, have had enough experience may remember, which is Netflix, 1.0. And, at the time of Netflix 1.0, when they were a DVD rental company, they just really appeared to everybody like they're just taking on, Blockbuster, and they're doing a better version of Blockbuster. But the reality is, if you peel that back, if you think about the Blockbuster experience back at that time, it was rush down on a Friday or Saturday night, try to get the, the latest movie that's come out before everybody else had, watch it, and then get it back to Blockbuster within 24 hours so you don't get the late fee. And, what Netflix ended up doing, which interestingly enough, they actually copied a lot of Blockbuster's model for their first year. But what they ended up doing was creating a totally different experience. It wasn't about that latest Blockbuster movie. It was about, at the time when DVDs were just coming around, how do you open up an entire library of 50,000, 60,000 plus DVDs that you can start borrowing on a subscription? And so it wasn't about, let's get the latest movie. It now became, what part of that long tail of content do we really want to watch? And so people started watching not just movies, but also documentaries, TV shows, all of these other things that they probably wouldn't have rented elsewhere. And it was a shift in that customer experience that gave them a much different outcome, where they could walk over to their TV, pick up a DVD that was sitting there that they had already subscribed to and decided that was their priority, and watch it anytime they wanted to. And really, that genesis, that thread, is what's led to, streaming and on-demand content, because they sort of created that in an analog way to begin with. And so that's really the first principle of the book is, how do you identify new opportunities by shifting the customer outcome, shifting it so that they fulfill their overall basic need, but they're doing it in such a profound way that it really shifts the market in your favor.
Interesting. I didn't even know Netflix did that, to be honest with you. I didn't realize that I never realized that they actually sent stuff to your house.
Yeah. Matt, you're not old enough to.
Oh, well, I'm probably old enough. I probably
it.
just didn't do it. But
yeah.
But there was a time when Netflix actually sent out, it was like a subscription then. You paid the monthly thing, and then you just got access to however many movies you wanted or whatever.
Absolutely, yeah. And they were delivered. And the interesting thing is that whether it's the original Netflix all the way through to where they are today, where they're creating their own content, it's always been guided by the same basic principle, which was set by CEO Reed Hastings right at the beginning, which is, how do we provide access to a deep level of content, of movies that our viewers love? So it's not about the one-off, it's about how do we give them everything that they want on demand? And that's changed the company over time. They've kind of gone through these different eras or epochs that they've had to change the company in order to change the definition of how they're doing that. And that, can be applied in so many different ways. One of the other companies that I talk about extensively is a company that you may be familiar with as well, called Dollar Shave Club. And Dollar Shave Club kind of revolutionized in some ways how you receive razors. And that's kind of like the first view that we have is, well, they were just a male version of what you would get from a Kmart or Walmart or Target or whomever it is. But the reality is they actually changed the user experience so profoundly that they created a new market. And that was the idea that it's not just about getting a razor, but it was about connecting like-minded men who wanted to have better grooming habits and wanted to be part of a community to do that. So it was, how do you connect with advice, things like beyond the razors themselves and looking for shaving cream and, facial cleansers and all of these other things. And it sort of shifted that experience. So you were no longer competing off of somebody like Gillette or Schick, where it was all about billion-dollar ad budgets and, what superstar you had who was endorsing your razor. It was about being part of a community, and that so profoundly changed the market that people gravitated towards that. And they ended up with $1 billion sale to Unilever because of it. So it really starts with that idea of how do you change that user experience or that user outcome.
And then, so what should be questions that, and so no matter what size of business that you're thinking, whether you're just, getting into business or been in business a long time, what questions should we be asking ourselves around that so that we can shift our mindset? Because typically I've found it with better questions, you get better outcomes. So what are the questions we should be asking ourselves to help us start to step into that mindset of being able to shift the customer experience?
To me, the primary area to focus on is not, how do we build a better product, but where can we take the customer? Where can we take that user, knowing what their basic need is? How do we build something around that is a unique experience, a unique outcome that literally will change the way that they look at that solution and how they define, their priorities in buying. So, to me, it's really focusing on that. And this gets to what I think is a really important area that is sort of the B side of my book, if you don't mind me saying. There's sort of the A side, which is, let's study the companies and look at, how they did it and come up with these basic principles. And I focus on basically three things. How do you find that new customer outcome? How do you grow your market? And then turning internally as the organization, how do you bring your company along with that experience so that they build it with you? But the sort of B side to my book is really some of the research that I did behind it, which is to look at who are the leaders behind these organizations and why were they any different? And the one thing that stood out as I looked across all of these companies is that about 75% of the founders of these organizations were actually industry outsiders. They were people who had no experience in the industry whatsoever. So, one of the things that just set me down was, why are they so good? And, why are there so many of these that are sort of those outsiders? And especially from the perspective of, when we look at an industry in particular, if you're in business, we prize people with industry experience. We look for resumes of people who have the background that we're looking for, who've done it before in the same market. We incentivize and we hire our leaders from those who are inside of the company. And yet, when you look at who are the game changers out there, they're mainly led by people who don't have any industry experience. So a lot of what we look at, and that I preach is that people really take this idea of an outsider's perspective. How do you build an outsider's mindset and look at what you're doing like somebody who's fresh to the market and who's curious about how you can improve it and make it better?
And that makes complete sense because, in any situation, that historical perspective, sometimes, there's value there. There's also limitations because it's kind of the old adage, well, that's the way we've always done it, right? That we get stuck in that, well, that's the way we've always done it if we've been around it. And I found myself in a couple situations where I'd founded companies and started stuff and, a decade later, and I'm just kind of like, at one point I just was like, okay, I need to fire myself because I am the one, right, holding everything back because I'm the one that's still thinking about that's the way we did it. Because I used to think I was super innovative, but I was like, but I'm the one causing us not to move forward because I'm not innovating.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, well, it was just, we were innovative when we got started, like in the healthcare field, we were innovative when we got started, but then we just kind of rested in that same innovation. We never migrated to something. We just kept the same model and we just kept repeating it versus actually looking at where is the innovation here.
Yeah, absolutely. And you think about, there's so many things that cause us to sort of swim upstream towards that outsider's mindset. You think about cognitive biases, we tend to have a confirmation bias, right? We always look for things that are going to support our conclusions already.
Right. Yeah, right.
We have an anchoring bias that, the first thing that we've learned or the first input is what we sort of, hold to or anchor to. And, those are really difficult for us to overcome unless we develop sort of a feedback loop where we start thinking about what's changed, what's different. And I put this at the very end of the book, but there's a whole loop process that we look at in terms of how do you evaluate where your kind of worldview is, what you're looking at today, and see incrementally what's changed, and then question: Am I fully understanding it? Am I filtering this? Am I going back to evidence that validates what I'm doing? And then based off of that, how do you reorient yourself and your company? What challenges are appearing that you need to go and focus on now? How do you act on that in a measured way so that you can evaluate how you're doing and then start that process over again? And one of the things that I think to me is most interesting, the way that I start the book actually is a story about Intel Corporation back in the 1980s, 1984 to be exact. And the company was not the Intel that we think of today that supplies the CPUs, the computer chips for computers today. They were in the memory business. And the three founders that were there had built such an amazing business already for 17 years, but it was struggling and it was running into some really, really deep competition, particularly from Japanese suppliers that had been able to build huge fabs, these fabrication plants that could build much cheaper memory than they could. And they were really just losing over and over and over again on these deals. And they kept trying to figure out, how are we going to get out of this? And those three were some of the most amazing managers in the tech industry of all time. This is Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore, and Andy Grove. And they literally, coming back to a phrase you had earlier, they got to a point where Andy Grove, they had reviewed what they should do over and over again. And Andy Grove had basically said, listen, what if we looked at things like we just got fired?
Right.
And then we're the new management team and we came back in the door today. What would we do? And the decision was so obvious that the three of them knew absolutely what they needed to do. And they literally walked outside the front door of the building in Santa Clara, turned around and came back in and said, we're going to do this, right? We're going to treat this just like we are new management. We fired those old three guys and we're taking over. And they had to start from the ground up. And it was a very painful couple of years for them in order to get out of the memory business. And very fortunately, they had this new emerging sort of PC market that was showing up at the time, but it was still uncertain. And they went after that market and, created an incredible success story. But when they did that, they completely reformulated what it meant to be a chip manufacturer in such a way that it profoundly, again, sort of transformed the market so that they had an advantage. But it all comes from that outsider perspective of, walking back in the door and saying, what would we do if we were different?
Right. And when you look at almost every industry, I've heard some of the examples, but like the largest taxi company in the world's now Uber, right? I mean, they don't own a single car, right? And the largest hotel company in the world is, one of the online hotel booking services, right? They book more rooms than any hotel. And so it was outsiders coming into using technology, but coming into a space and thinking about what's the better customer experience versus, the hotel chains were they were just siloed in their own little, we're Marriott and we're, Hilton and they weren't really thinking, how do you work? They were just selling rooms in their space. They didn't disrupt themselves is the word I'm coming to, is I've heard that used a lot, is you have to disrupt your own way of thinking. You have to disrupt your own company or someone else will come in and disrupt it for you. Right. Yeah. So you're either the disruptor or the disruptee. And if you're wondering which you are, then you're the disruptee. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. I mean,
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting because one of the topics that I have in the book, a chapter is dedicated towards building new capabilities as an organization. Once you've recentered on that customer outcome and said, this is what we're going to build that is different, oftentimes that takes a new type of company to fulfill that. And it takes new capabilities. So I spend a chapter talking about how to evaluate and identify what are the core capabilities. And, it may be everybody else has had assets in this area. They've all, had the cars or they've had the hotels or whatever it is, but we are going to do something different that's going to replace that. But it's all centered around, let's throw everything out the window, except for what is going to help us build that core customer outcome that we're trying to achieve. And you're right. One of the two interesting statistics that come up that are very parallel to each other in the research that I've done is 60% of organizational leaders today believe that their next competitor is going to come from outside of their industry. So they're already thinking, an outsider is going to come in and change what I'm doing. Likewise, another study found that 56% of CEOs in the global 2000 said, my best opportunity is to actually disrupt my own industry rather than trying to keep it as the status quo. So again, it comes back to this, outsider view. If you really want, performance that is orders of magnitude above where you are, you think like an outsider. If you want to kind of stay the course, you think more like an insider. And the key for leaders is, how do I develop that outsider's view? How do I develop that mindset?
Right. Of course. And how do they? That's a great question, William. A lot of times we've worked with consultants, we've worked with people that could help us. We went through leadership training programs. We've helped, we've kind of said, okay, how do you disrupt yourself? Because a lot of times, especially in entrepreneurial companies, the company is not going to be able to grow past the founder and the founder's ability to expand, right? And so really, I heard John, is it Mackey or McKay with Whole Foods, the founder of Whole Foods, talking, and he said every time his company stalled out, every time they plateaued at Whole Foods, he would look at himself and say, I am not growing as a human being. I'm not growing as a person. And so he would go do something to kind of do self-exploration to allow his own personal ideas and awareness expand. And then he said, and then the company would take off again. But it was kind of that, you just get used to doing what you're doing. And if you're having success, it's almost a curse sometimes, because the success is keeping you doing what you're doing. So you're almost fearful of, well, this feels good, right? This feels good. I'm succeeding in this area. I don't want to disrupt. I don't even want to think about disruption, because I don't want the pain of what if that fails.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave you a lot of stuff to do. I gave you a lot of stuff to work with.
There's
Sorry,
a lot there.
I just was dropping in all kinds of stuff. You can open any of those doors.
Okay, well, let's go back to the first one, which is how do you become an outsider? How do you really build that mindset? For me, I break this up into two areas. How do you do that personally, and how do you help train your organization or incentivize your team to be able to do that? And I think one builds on the other from my perspective. If you look at the outsiders that are out there, both as outsiders, I would say, and insiders who think like outsiders, there's I think very positive examples of individuals who are able to rethink their markets. And they may be insiders. One of the great examples, I think, is Mark Benioff from Salesforce, the CEO of Salesforce.
Yeah.
He came from the software industry. He's one of those few that was like an insider who went off and built something totally different in terms of building that sort of software as a service, or software that's being in the cloud. Mm-hmm. I think about others like Sam Walton, who ran Walmart, mm-hmm. Or founded Walmart. He was an insider, and he ran his own retail stores beforehand. You look at across those leaders, and I think you see a fairly common pattern. Number one, they're curious individuals. They're people who are willing to open up those questions and ask further. Are we doing this the right way? Really, kind of settling in and understanding. Two, they hire for diversity inside of their organization. They look for people outside of out of their market. And for them personally, they build their own personal networks and interests outside of their own business. So they tend to, have advisors or have other people that they sort of hang around with that are outside of it. And three, they are keen studiers of not only their own industry and understand it, but of other markets and other industries as well. So I think they look a lot to the outside and try to borrow from those individual areas. So those are really, really important, sort of personal elements. And I think they sort of roll into, how do you do this as an organization as well? One of the things that I always advocate is, if you're going to take that outsider orientation, you have to develop curiosity as a company. You have to develop diversity as an organization to do this. So, one of the first things I look at is, you have to yourself be curious and be open and inclusive inside of your own team, and let them know that you are interested in what their ideas are. I just saw a data point which is similar to one that I include in the book, which is, the level of engagement of employees today is just incredibly low. I think, it was beforehand. I think it's even lower now, but the average company, about 32% of the employees are actually actively engaged, meaning they're doing beyond just sort of the bare minimum.
Right.
And I think a lot of it is, we talk about quiet quitting and everything else today.
Yep.
I think a big portion of it is they just don't feel like what they're doing is meaningful, or that they're really being asked to do anything more than what they're told to do. And so, to me, a lot of it is just being open in the organization to ideas, to, providing a forum for people to be able to do that. Second is, I always advocate that companies sort of build what I call their worldview. They develop a profile of what does the market look like for them and for their customer, and what's happening. What are the latest trends in technology, legal, social, environmental, and list down what you think are the biggest factors that are impacting both your company and industry, as well as the customers that you're servicing, and sort of make that your framework, and be willing to question those things. Bring them up. I have a great example of a friend who's the CEO of a company, and she actually did this, and she developed sort of 3 things that she put together in PowerPoint. And she would come into every meeting, every board meeting, every management team meeting, every team, entire team meeting. And she would bring in these 3 slides. And it was basically, here's our worldview of what we've all put together. We've all agreed that this is what it looks like. Here's how it's impacting our customer and what we think their needs are today. And here is what we need to build and be in order to be able to best service our customers. And she would
Mm-hmm.
put that up in every single meeting and say,
Mm-hmm.
if you think we're missing something, if you think something here is no longer relevant, let's talk about it. Talk about it
Right.
now, come to me afterwards. Let's continually challenge what we have documented as our view of the world so that
Mm-hmm.
we can identify areas that we can improve and be better. And to
Right.
me, that's an inspiration and something that
Totally.
that type of openness just shows
Mm-hmm.
a leadership to say we're open to to changing and to adapting as our needs require it.
Right. Totally. Yeah, that's very inspirational. Not the norm for most companies, right? I mean, I think new innovative companies or new or people that are I think that's the company definitely of the future has to be that way, right? I mean, there's just no other. The world is just changing. The world's changing how people interact, changing how they communicate, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. But I think to your point, employees are going to, and people in general are going to gravitate towards companies that are more open to that line of communication and doing something about it. It's one thing to take a customer service call and say, kind of placate the situation. It's another to actually look at those things and say, okay, is this something we need to actually pivot in some way? Not maybe a full pivot, but or do we need to make, what are we missing here? What is going on? I mean, and if we look back over the last 100 years, and I can't remember the actual statistic, but if you look at the major companies that were on the exchange 100 years ago, there's maybe, I don't know, 5%, 10% that are still in existence today, right? Because they didn't innovate, right? Or the market changed and they didn't, companies that succeed are the ones that are more open to what is the market actually doing, what is happening in the world, and we're going to do something about it versus we're just tired.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. And in fact, we've seen that pace accelerate over time. If you look at the turnover, for example, of Fortune 500 companies,
right.
It's happened faster than it ever has before. And you're seeing companies come up from basically, outside of that market to disrupting and displacing companies that are at the top of the market at a faster pace than we've ever seen before. And I think that's just a call for leadership to say, we have to start thinking like outsiders. And at one point, I mean, we're talking sort of when I gave my example about the CEO, you can think, well, that's easy. She was in a 100-person company. It's fairly easy to do. Some of these same principles can be applied if they're cultural, if they're actually put into the culture of the organization in any size organization. One of the things I always talk about is, if you're hiring people from the outside, sort of capture those outsiders and get their thoughts and opinion before they come in and sort of the corporate antibodies, take that out of them. Why did they join? Why did they come into this industry? What excites them, about it? What ideas do they have that could be unique or innovative? And sort of capture that, that DNA of those individuals coming in before they sort of, end up adopting, the ways of the company and they've kind of forgot those great ideas. And that can be done anywhere. You could be a business unit manager or have a department that you're running. If you hire somebody new, if your culture is really mirroring this at that level, people will be interviewing they'll be doing entry interviews and talking about what are your ideas? Nothing is sort of off limits here. Tell us about what you think, or, how would you do things differently? Sort of capturing that feeling when they're coming into the company.
Right. And then, to your point, then the next thing is like in your example of the lady who was doing that in every meeting is then continuing to keep those channels of communication open, right? So that there's always that free flow, even as a leader, if it's painful to hear, because it's like one more thing that you have to take on or one more thing you have to think about. Those little things can mean a lot if they're, again, if we want to get out of our own way or if we want to grow in our awareness, where does that come from? It's coming from the outside, where it's coming from those outside perspective. It's coming from the market. And the only way to really tell that's to be in tune and engaged with the market in some way, shape, or form. I know how I've made a lot of mistakes through my life thinking I knew what the customer wanted, delivering a product and then going, well, that's not actually what the customer wanted. I was, and if you're off by 10, 20, 30%, that could be failure, instant failure.
Yeah.
And so how do you stay connected to what the customer wants?
I think that's a great question because there's always this balance between identifying what the customer wants and also identifying where can you take the customer and
Right.
and give them something that's completely different. One of the best examples I think about in that is you think about Amazon and Amazon Prime. And Amazon Prime to me is one of the most interesting products, I'll call it, that's in the market. If you look at the amount of revenue that Amazon makes from Amazon Prime, it would literally be in the Fortune 500 on its own. I think it would be just the Prime by itself. Subscription service itself, be like 230 or something like that on the Fortune 500. And it's such a mishmash of things. It's it's free shipping, it's access to Kindle library.
Right.
It is it's music, it's video, it's all of these things. Well, who asked for that? Nobody did.
Nobody.
So
I signed up in the beginning. It was free shipping,
right.
And still is for me in my mind. But yes, I'm accessing these other things too, right?
Yeah. So some of it, you could never go to a customer and say, well, what do you want? Well, yeah, I want free shipping plus video and music and all these other things.
Right.
So there's always this careful balance, this art between how do we define what it is that the customer wants and what can we give them. And again, it kind of goes back to the first principle of my book Transformative, which is you're really looking for how do you identify things that will change the way that the customer looks at the product, that will give them a new set of benefits. And really what I look at as a key to that is, does it change their buying criteria? So you keep that seed, that nugget of what they're looking for today, but then you build around it to the point where they're now looking at that as something completely different to them, and they have a different reason for buying that makes it incomparable with anything else in the market. To me, a prime example of this is a company like Starbucks. Starbucks created essentially, I mean, you can look at Peet's Coffee and some of the other kind of precursors. Starbucks really created the mass sort of democratization of a place where you could go and buy coffee, and it was a replacement for what people were doing in the past, which was making it at home or going into the office. But the reality is they kept that sort of nugget of, it's centered around getting a cup of coffee, and created a whole new experience around what, they call a third place, a place that's not home, that's not work, where you could sit, you could maybe do a little bit of work, you could meet with people. I mean, there was just this whole other element around it where you just said, we're going to keep this piece, which is people want a cup of coffee in the morning or, in the afternoon. But we're going to build this other element around it that is just so compelling that now that's the reason why they go rather than just the coffee itself.
Yeah, totally. And so, they were taking something to your point, and in your book, they were taking something that was already happening, but how do we do that? Not only just better, they didn't make better. I'll argue the fact that they didn't make better coffee necessarily, even though I'm sure most people feel like that go there feel like they did. But it was really how do they create the experience around that activity that was already happening?
Right. Exactly. Right? Exactly.
And I think back to the example that was given, like Steve Jobs when he created the iPod, similar thing, right? It was people were listening to music, people were getting music, but then all of a sudden he made it just super easy to download it onto some device that you could take with us and make your own playlists, right? Make your own playlists, have much like Netflix, a lot broader spectrum of here's all these artists here's all this different music that I can download on this device. And people would have never necessarily thought, hey, I need a device where I can download all my music, right? I have the radio or I have this, right? It wasn't.
Yeah.
So it was doing something, the kernel or the seed was people are listening to music. How do we do it so that it makes it easier, faster, more convenient, and more reach, or more a bigger library for them to choose from, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great example. That leverages one of the pieces that I talk about for outcome innovators, where the convenience factor is always a huge piece. It's this idea of creating sort of product flow, and convenience is a huge element of that, of just making it easier for finding things. And it's a key pivot point for innovation. One of the principles I look at is this idea of democratization. How do you make something that's just available for everybody? And we think about democratization might be cheaper and easier to find or something like that, but it could be simplification. It could be things like just time and location. How do you put something in front of somebody that is so much more convenient for them to get access to. That's a huge form of democratization that I think, really enables organizations. We saw sort of the rise of the DVD market, years ago in Redbox. And Redbox's, simple principle was, most movies are watched like in an evening after somebody gets home from work. So why don't I just put all of these 40,000 Redbox, distribution points where people go, to a fast food place or a grocery store or at a convenience store. And that is a democratization in a way, because it's a location and a time availability to it, that you just show up, you see it there, you can pick something up. And, those are the elements that when you really peel back and you start thinking about how do I change an outcome for somebody, makes it just so much easier. When you look at those micro elements of, I can make this more convenient, more democratized, more available for people. And, the other elements are around just convenience and, mass customization. How do I make it available to people in the way that they want it? And music was a big portion of that. Is, it's mass customization. It's available. I can download, take whatever I want, or buy whatever I want, not, these mass libraries or albums.
Right. Exactly. I love your stuff. How do people typically, I know you have your website, right? WilliamKilmer.com.
That's right. Yeah.
Pretty straightforward.
It's pretty straightforward. People can find me there. They can reach out to me directly there, and happy to engage with people.
Yeah. And then typically, how do you work with organizations? Do you, when you're working with organizations, typically, what are you doing? Are you looking at the technology side? Are you looking at the platform side? What are you kind of helping them identify?
Yeah. As an investor, first and foremost, I work with a lot of startups, and most of that is around investing, working with the management team, helping them to find, new opportunities, doing some advisory work. With other companies, I've tended to work around a few areas. Principally, I think one of the two things that I often talk about with organizations is building, or in a lot of cases, rebuilding a foundation on culture and values, and how to create the right culture for an organization that's tailor-made for them. The other piece is working with leadership teams around how to think like an outsider. How do you reassess, what you're doing, but also learn the practice of an outsider's mindset so that you can apply it for yourself in the future.
I love it. And all of this, obviously is in the book. So the easy thing is just to go to Amazon, as you've already said, right? Just just click on to buy the Transformative book, start there. And I think it's so needed today because it's happening already. It's not like you need to do this to be cutting edge. You just need to do this just to kind of stay status quo almost anymore. You have to be transformative just to meet the market where the market's going, or you're behind. It's kind of like if you're not transforming, you're already missing the bus has already left the station. Right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's very true. But, and then there's also just this power of doing something that is so different, that is energizing, as we talked about at the very beginning, and that helps build an organization that people want to be at, that they're engaged at, and that they're actively contributing to. It just takes companies to a whole different level. And it really starts with, really examining the management team, examining how you're approaching things, and being open to new ideas and to engaging your team on achieving something great.
Love it. I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on the BriteVibe podcast. We really appreciate that. And we'll definitely put links in the links to your stuff in the show notes. But thank you so much for coming on. And we as we say so often, anytime you'd like to come back, you write another book, you have something that you're like, hey, people need to know this. We'd love to have you come back on and share this with our community, because it's all about sharing knowledge and from people that are kind of experts in their field and with what they do. So thank you, William, so much for coming on today.
Thanks, Matt. I had a great time, and look forward to talking again.
Perfect. Thank you for being a part of the BriteVibe podcast. For more information, go to britevibe.com. That's BRITE Vibe, VIBE.com. Thank you for listening.